All right, the Tumultuous, the 1960s, looking at a generation in conflict, the years 1960 to 1974. So in 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected, and his campaign was on creating a new frontier of American politics and culture. And in fact, in his inaugural speech, he gave the very famous quote, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." And in that speech, he also promised to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade, which would be 1969, and to hold the Soviet bloc accountable for human rights. So here's JFK at his speech. He also, in his early years of his presidency, promoted world peace through friendship and a creation of a Peace Corps, which would be made available to interested countries, where volunteers of men and women would be qualified for service abroad and work in countries that needed trained manpower. So here he is meeting with the first batch of Peace Corps volunteers in 1961. On November 22nd, 1963, JFK was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, outside the Dallas Book Depository. And immediately, LBJ is sworn in on Air Force One with Jackie Kennedy by his side to be president of the United States. This was a day of national mourning, or a month of mourning, as a highly popular president was mourned and grieved by the American public. But LBJ had to sort of step up and continue his work. 1965 to 74 is kind of known as a decade of protest, and it was marked by the escalation of the Vietnam War, what was a perceived attack on middle class values, an increase in college enrollment. You had all of those baby boomers that were born in that immediate post-war era who are now coming of age and attending college. And initial liberal protests actually began on those college campuses and are inspired by other national protests. The 60s generation, my parents, the baby boomers, are the best educated Americans up until this point in American history. They protest the Vietnam and used it as a social criticism, and also intensified a war at home. These national protests also inspired more of a civil rights movement, a Mexican American movement, a Native American movement, a women's movement, and a counterculture movement. 1965 was a year of turmoil and unrest nationally. You had a lot of urban unrest, and riots break out in the Watts neighborhood in Los Angeles. African Americans, blacks were protesting unemployment, high unemployment rates among the urban poor blacks, as well as what they viewed as unfair police practices. These riots broke into looting, and the police cracked down on them, and then they spread throughout the country, and you saw similar riots in places like Chicago and Cleveland, Detroit, etc., where you had large concentrations of African Americans in inner cities. By the end of the 1960s, upon the assassination of Martin Luther King, you saw a national commission that had investigated that assassination that concluded our nation was moving more towards two separate societies, black and white, and separate and unequal. And this is what we saw as the Brown versus Board of Education decision of 1954 came into play. More and more whites were moving into suburbs outside of the city. So we're seeing de facto segregation happening, and an intensification of that segregation, despite all of these movements like the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which were supposed to create a more level playing field. Despite that, you still saw an immense amount of inequality nationally. So here's some images from those riots and the looting. Student protests inspired by the civil rights movement begin on college campuses, and the first big one starts in 1964 on the UC Berkeley campus with a free speech movement which students were protesting sort of the corporate face of the campus, as well as 1950s style rules that they felt were very confining and constricting. Students rioted when they were denied a political voice on campus, and this inspired the formation of the Students for a Democratic Society, and they worked to end racism, poverty, and violence. The campus refused, so they were refusing to let the free speech movement collect money for off-campus causes as a violation of school code of conduct, and that's where people were saying it was the use of free speech, etc. So this is the gentleman who inspired the free speech riots on the college campus, and Berkeley has still become known as this sort of very liberal, student-driven campus where you can still see people protesting today. There you go. And these student-led protests then start to inspire protests on other college campuses like the University of Michigan, Brown University, and a lot of colleges end the in loco parentis rules, because a lot of times in the 1950s and 60s, if you were on a college campus, the university legally acted as your parent. So they had very strict rules and regulations on behavior and codes of conduct. And that's one of the things that these kids were protesting, especially since they were of age to be drafted into the military. They wanted more adult rights and freedoms. All of these student protests coincide with a growing youth counterculture movement in 1965. It begins in San Francisco and begins spreading throughout the U.S. It becomes known as the hippie culture, and it emphasized sexual expression, really interesting bohemian style clothing, the use of mind altering drugs, and rock and roll music. You saw an increase in premarital sex and the use of the pill. 1967 becomes known as the Summer of Love. Here you have some stylish clothing. And you had psychoactive and hallucinogenic drugs. Songs like Everyone Must Get Stoned by Bob Dylan. LSD, which is being promoted by Harvard professor Timothy Leary, who's encouraging everyone to tune in, turn on, and drop out. And you had several different types of music, such as folk music with Bob Dylan and Joan Baez. You have the British invasion and electric rock with the Beatles, the Stones. And then you had acid rock, such as the Grateful Dead and Jimi Hendrix. Music was an important element to the 60s counterculture movement. Folk singers like Joan Baez and Bob Dylan were really very popular in their acoustic style. Dylan actually ended up having a bit of a backlash when he switched to electric guitar. Electric rock, like the Beatles, was very popular, and you see them shift into a more psychedelic style of music as well as they get into their Sgt. Pepper album and their White Album. Acid rock, like the Grateful Dead, yes, there's Jerry, and became touring bands, and you would have groups of kids that would follow them from show to show. All of this culminates with what becomes the first big sort of 3-day rock concert that inspires the South by Southwest, Lollapalooza, Coachella that you have today, and that was Woodstock, which was on a farm in Woodstock, New York. And lots of kids showed up and listened to 3 days of music, and it was very peaceful, but there was a lot of drugs and alcohol consumed. So Woodstock was sort of the culmination of that 60s hippie movement. A lot of hippies sort of bucked the system, grew their hair long, and burned their draft cards, were involved in the anti-war protests. Haight-Ashbury, which is a block in San Francisco, became sort of a center for hippies counterculture. And this became the question, is this the nation's Youth. Most of this counterculture movement was made up of children from upper middle class families. 1968 was one of the most turbulent years in U.S. history. Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy were assassinated. Riots broke out at the Democratic National Nominating Convention for the president, and the Tet Offensive started, which showed the U.S. was not winning the war in Vietnam. Here you have the assassination of Martin Luther King, of RFK, who was JFK's brother and who was running for president and likely to win, and then the riots breaking out at the Chicago Democratic National Convention, and then the Tet Offensive, where body counts were going up. So the Vietnam War was heating up and escalating in the late 60s, and in the most dramatic focus of youthful rebellion was this war in Vietnam. And most of the anti-war protests were led by college students who were escaping the draft by staying in college. These students were protesting the military-industrial complex and the disproportionate use of Black and Hispanic soldiers. Partly the reason those folks were getting sent to Vietnam in larger numbers than white middle-class kids was because those kids could not afford college. Protests got stronger as fighting intensified in Vietnam from 1966 forward. You had people resisting the draft, burning their draft cards, music being written about it. And you can see the increase of soldiers. We only had 900 troops in 1960, and by 1968 there were over 500,000 troops in Vietnam. So you have the peak of troops in 1968. In 1968, the Viet Cong, the North Vietnamese, launched the Tet Offensive against the U.S. forces in South Vietnam. This attack was contrary to U.S. media propaganda and reports that the U.S. was being very successful and was winning the war. The attack was pushed by LBJ and his Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, and the war was escalated because of them, and this attack led LBJ to be convinced that we couldn't win the war. So he begins discussions to seek a truce and announced he would not seek re-election. So you can see here on how both Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand get involved in this as these become routes into South Vietnam at the time. Don't know why the computer's being slow. Anti-war protests appeared on college campuses all over the United States, encouraging the United States to get out of Vietnam. In 1968, you also had the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. He was assassinated in Memphis at the age of 39, and immediately race riots break out in over 100 cities across the nation. You have Black-owned businesses and white-owned businesses that were sort of the targets of those race riots. You have RFK, who was a proponent, a presidential candidate, and brother to John F. Kennedy. This is Robert F. Kennedy running for president, and he's most likely going to be the Democratic Party's nominee, and he gets assassinated, and he's very popular with African Americans. The withdrawal of LBJ and the death of RFK only leaves two candidates, and that gets into a convention fight, and you show angry protesters and police fighting outside the convention, and Hubert Humphrey is nominated for election. McCarthy was an anti-war supporter. Humphrey was more of a Cold War, Truman-style leader, and ultimately the Republicans win the election with Richard Nixon. So here's some of the protest images and the fights outside of the convention. It'll be interesting to see how this plays out. There's a lot of talk in this 2016 election cycle that we could see another very turbulent nominating convention with regards to the Republicans this year. Hopefully not this violent. Here you can see the Electoral College and how it played out. Republicans benefited from the Vietnam disaster and the disruptions with